So we're in our second week of our series we're calling the Blessed and Happy series. And we're naming that. That's based on the Beatitudes. Blessed are those, or happy are those who, and it continues. We're looking at the Sermon on the Mount. Now, if you remember, probably close to a year ago, I preached the Sermon on the Mount, just preached the text. And today I want to look at, or this series rather, is looking at the different themes and different things that Jesus said. And so we're looking at those individually. What Jesus said in one sermon we could cover for years, actually. So we'll try not to do years today. How that? We'll try to get you. We'll try to help you beat the Baptist to lunch. How's that? Today we're going to read from Matthew chapter 5, verses 13 through 16. And as we read through that, I invite you to join with me as it's found on the screen. Jesus said these words. He said, "You are the salt of the earth, but if salt loses its saltiness, how will it become salty again? It's good for nothing but except to be thrown away and trampled under people's feet. You are the light of the world. A city on the top of a hill can't be hidden. Neither do people light a lamp and put it under a basket. Instead, they put it on top of a lampstand, and it shines on all who are in the house. In the same way, let your light shine before people so they can see the good things you do and praise your Father who is in heaven." So in my nerdy way that I do things sometimes, I go back and look at these words and the context and all those things. And I'll just tell you that in this passage, the way it's worded in the original wording in Greek, when Jesus says "you," that is very prominent. And so actually the strongest word, the most impact is put on the word "you," and not necessarily salt or light, but rather "you." So Jesus is saying, you. And so that's the Greek emphasis here is on you are the salt of the earth. So understand that when it's written the way it's written, and we understand that Jesus, as he gives a sermon, Jesus' mood in teaching this is not a soft, it's not meek, it's not mild teaching. The mood of Jesus' words here are not whispered like, "You are the salt of the earth. If it's lost its flavor, what good is salt anyway?" I mean, you can barely hear those words when they're whispered. But no, when we read the context of this, these words are not whispered, but these are strong words. And Jesus says, you are the salt of the earth. You are the light of the world. So we notice also, as we're looking through this, the way it's written, it's used as a present tense. And so Jesus tells his followers, you are the salt of the earth, the light of the world. And it's not some distant thing. I hope someday that you will become the salt of the earth. Or if you do things better, or if you get better, if you become a better Christian, none of that's in there. Jesus is telling his followers, you are the salt of the earth, the light of the world. And so what we find is Jesus starts explaining the realm of Christianity, that God's world. We see, and I'll use this terminology, that we need to be tasty and lit up. Okay? Now, no, being lit has a different, but we'll leave that one alone, okay? But tasty and lit up. So those who follow Jesus don't merely just sit back and receive abundant life or simply tell others about how great my life is because I love Jesus and Jesus loves me. Jesus talking here about making a difference for others in our world, making a difference for others. We are the salt that adds tastiness to lives around. We are the light that makes plain or visual the order and the difference that God wants us to make in the world, or the difference of God's world, the difference He wants there to be. So here's one more thing. Salt nor light exist for themselves. So now my grandkids used to, when they were small and they would go eat with grandparents, they got by with things, that they didn't get by with parents. And so on occasion, a granddaughter or grandson would rip open a package of sugar and just, boy, it's sweet, it's good. They never did that with the salt shaker. And so salt and light don't exist just for themselves. We don't just sit down and eat salt like is on our altar this morning. Nobody's grabbed that spoon and shoved a spoonful of salt in their mouth. It's the same way with light. We just don't sit around looking at the sun all day or a light bulb. Salt and light, their purpose is fulfilled when they're used to help other things exist, or so we can see other things, or so we can taste other things better. And so that's what they exist for. So if we're salt and light, then we exist not just for ourselves, but so that we can make other people's world better. So salt and light are both precious. They were precious commodities in Jesus' time. Matter of fact, they both sustained life. Neither one can be easily produced on its own. I just say that, and they're gifts of creation, and they require quite a bit of ingenuity to access them or to conserve them. So, it's easy for us to think light's not that big a deal. You flip the switch, right? But when you think somebody had to invent the light bulb, and before that somebody had to invent electricity, and then we have to get the light bulb here. Somebody has to make them, get enough here that we can have one too. And then somebody has to get electricity here and make enough of it that we can get enough here so that everybody else in the world can have their electricity too. It takes quite a bit to be the light, to bring the light to us. But I want you to notice how Jesus talks about the light not being snuffed, but covered up. In other words, He's not saying you could be the light of the world if your light doesn't go out. He says you are the light of the world, but He says don't cover it up. The light's not extinguished. He doesn't say if you're not perfect that your light is extinguished. He's saying that our light sometimes gets covered up with a basket, and then the light is ineffective. And that's what makes the difference. Jesus gives the central insight that lights don't magically end up underneath bushels. In other words, if you light a candle in a room because you want some soft light in your living room, and you light a candle and you go to the kitchen to get the popcorn out of the microwave and you come back in, your light isn't automatically covered up with a basket. Okay? What Jesus is telling us that He says that no one, after lighting a candle or putting a lamp, puts it under a basket. That's what He says. No one does that. And basically, Jesus is saying that for us to light a light and then cover it up so that it doesn't do anybody any good is not very smart. Nobody would do that. Jesus saying it's ridiculous to do that. And He's very clear that if we put a basket or a bushel over the light, that blocks it, but that only happens when we put it there. So our light's going to shine. We are the light. So if when we're followers, we are the light of the world, it will shine unless we do something that covers that up. So I was a few years back. I was listening to a college student that was home. I'll give an example of how we shine as a light, or the salt of the earth. This college student was home from school, and I was listening to her tell a story, and she was talking about the decision that she had made to not use alcohol at school, in college. People use that in order to have a good time or whatever. And so the reason, as I heard it as she was talking, was from a personal conviction that she had. And her take on it was that honesty and intensity in relationship are hard when you're, and her words, are hard while you're killing brain cells with booze. That was her take on that. And so that student said that it was a personal decision, that it was just for her. She wasn't trying to talk anyone else into thinking the way she was thinking. But she also said that she was surprised at how threatening that behavior was to everyone else. People would come up to her at one of the gatherings. I think they call them parties. They would come up to her at one of their gatherings and be people she hardly knew, and they would make snide remarks to her, calling her Miss Goody Two Shoes was one of the names that I heard that they were calling. See, it seemed to drive other students crazy that one person said no, as if they couldn't party themselves if there was still one person left on that part of campus who didn't need to be drunk in order to carry on a conversation, a meaningful conversation with a person of the opposite sex. But here's the thing. People notice a little salt. People notice a little light. I mean, do you see what the reason I gave us that story? I mean, in a world where there are no values, anyone who believes anything is perceived as a threat to the establishment. Because somebody's going to talk about that. Anyone who has even 1 ounce of self-possession, knows who they are, what they want, has a way of underscoring how enslaved others are to the status quo. And I think you'll find that in our society today that often people feel like they have to convert you for fear that you're going to subvert them. Somehow people know that just a little salt goes a long way. It's as if people of the world don't know that they are superficial until they come face to face with someone who isn't. I think what the world really needs is for you and me to be redeemed. But then what really happens at that point is that people start realizing that the world is fallen and that it's corrupt and that the world's sin-filled when they see people of faith. When we are in the world living our faith. So the world must stumble across just one free person that's running loose before it sees how enslaved it is to all the masters. Jesus says it this way. He says, "You are the light of the world." He's saying you're the only light the world has. So if you hide it under a basket, everyone stumbles because they can't see where they need to go. Bishop Will Willimon stated that he was at Duke University at the seminary there for years. But Bishop Will Willimon stated that disciples who don't look like disciples and churches which have chameleon-like blended into the wallpaper of secular culture are not much help in showing anyone the way out of the dark. That's a quote from him. The more we blend in rather than shine out, the less helpful we are. And he continues, Will Willimon says, Jesus says that salt that has stopped being salty is moante. That's a Greek word which if you translate it directly across means moronic or stupid. says that salt that has stopped being salty is just stupid. There's no salt that is no longer salty deserves no better than to be the doormat of the world, because there's no benefit in it at all. So the question I think that comes up is, why would Jesus use the metaphors of salt and light? What's the purpose of salt and light? I mean, we've talked a little bit about that, but what really was important? And I'm going to talk more about salt today, just because we just finished a series where light was the main theme, and so I just look at the salt more so today than light. You know, people in Jesus' day didn't have refrigerators, they didn't have ice makers, and so salt was very important in preservation of food. They used it to preserve their vegetables. They would preserve fish for the winter time, and that is what they would do. They would clean the fish, and then they would salt it, and that would dry it out, and then they could brush the salt off and use it when they were ready to use it. And also, in biblical times, it was said, one of the phrases that was used was that a person's life was as valuable as a bag of salt. It puts quite a bit of value in a bag of salt, I would think. And when they offered their offerings to the synagogue, and they would go and they would offer that, they were required by law, if you go back to Deuteronomy, they were required by law to put salt on the offerings, on the grain offerings, so that the grain would not mold and rot. That would pull the moisture out, so it would last longer. When they had new babies in those days, they would wash them down with salt water for medicinal and for cleansing purposes. They found that when they did that, more babies lived. The Jews of the Bible, at time, they would make covenants with each other, and they didn't read and write like we do. They didn't have all this legalese stuff that we use today. And so what they would do, they didn't have written contracts so much, and so what they would do, if I was going to buy land from you, we would agree on a price and how it was going to be paid, and then I would take salt from my house, which is a very valuable asset to have in my house. They would take salt from their house, and he would throw it over the other person's shoulder, and that was called a covenant of salt, which was symbolic of the preservation of the contract. You know, but salt also preserved life. Salt was so important that soldiers were paid in salt. That's how they were paid. Because wherever they were at, wherever doing, you didn't have to have a certain currency. If they paid you in food, there'd be some places that people didn't eat certain things, but everybody needed salt to live. So they would pay them in salt. So salt was a currency that worked wherever they were at. Because, see, you have to have salt, because if you don't have salt, what you have is decay. And so I think that's very important for us to understand that Jesus uses the term salt. You are the salt of the earth, because we have to have salt to preserve life. Salt was important in Jesus' time because of the wars. There were so many wars going on, such as there is today. And wars were fought essentially with bows and arrows and with spears and swords. And so there was a lot of cutting. There was stabbing and cutting. So you'd have these flesh wounds. And if you were a wounded soldier, chances were that you were cut from a spear or a sword, and you had to have salt. So you would rub salt, you would rub salt into this wound. It just sounds, and it was sharp, and it hurt a lot. But it would save your life. You would use the salt if you were going to experience healing. It was part of the way you treated wounds in that day. And so that is the importance of salt. And Jesus said, you are the salt of the earth. One of the most important things of life itself, that's you. And if you have lost your saltiness, I might as well throw you out on the ground to be trampled, because at that point you've lost your purpose in this world. You are the salt of the earth. And then Jesus' invitation is to live out discipleship in the world. You are the salt of the earth. We talked about salt. It's not just for the salt itself. We don't cut off a chunk off a salt block and throw it in our mouth. We use just a little and we season food with it. And so we use it to benefit others. And so if we're the salt of the earth, our benefit is for other people. And so Jesus is saying you are something that is to be used to benefit others. You are to live out your discipleship out in the world. You are to live out your discipleship in your school. You're to live out your discipleship in the place that you're employed. You're to live out your discipleship. You're following Jesus. You're to be the salt of the earth in your neighborhood, in your circle of friends. Out in the world, be the light where it's often dark. Out in the world where it's often not so godly. And since I think salt, the purpose of salt is to preserve the quality of life, I think salty Christians then are to preserve the moral and the spiritual, and I'll even say the political health of a nation. Because there is always the possibility, and I might even add probability, that a nation can begin to decay if they remove themselves or if the moral standards are not kept. And so every once in a while I find myself, and maybe you do too, asking what's going on in our society. Is it just that I'm growing older, or is the media exaggerating just so they can sell violence, so they can be the number one news channel or whatever station? And I think sometimes, if you're like me, we kind of get this idea, I don't know what to do. Sometimes I don't. But here's what Jesus said. Jesus said, you are the salt of the earth. You are the moral preservative in our world. You are the moral preservative of our society. You need to make your society, our society, a better place. We are to help preserve the moral values of this, our community. That's our job, yours and mine. I think one of the best things that a church does is teach children to love Jesus and to walk in the ways of Christ. I mean, that is a way of preserving our moral values and foundation. What happens, these kids go back, especially after a VBS or they go to camp, and they have one of these great experiences. They go back to schools re-energized, revitalized for Jesus Christ. And then they are the salt of the earth in their schools. But it's not just the ministries of our congregation. Because we, you and me, as individuals, are also called to be the salt in our society and within the jobs that we hold in our society. Martin Luther, about halfway through his ministry, he was a pastor at a church there for about 24 years. About 12 years into his ministry there, he wrote a sermon, and in that sermon he said this. He said that salt bites. He was writing a sermon on "You are the salt of the earth," and he said that salt bites. He said that when the people in your congregation sin, that you're to rub salt in the wounds of their sin. Doesn't sound very friendly, does it? You're to rub salt in the wounds of their sin, is what Martin Luther said. I like this. What he says. Luther, he said in this same sermon, he says this. Let me quote him. He said, "Bishops and successful clergy are the smartest of people." It's awesome, right? We're smart. "For they preach in a calculated manner in order to keep themselves out of trouble by refusing to salt the sins of their people and press for genuine repentance." Ouch. Another place, one of the things I read this past week said, I think for some of us we need to rephrase that and say, you are the syrup of the world. All sweet and sticky and nice. You don't hurt anything. Well, let's go back farther than Martin Luther. The words of the prophets in the Old Testament were tart, they were cutting, they were bitter, they were often tasted sharp like salt. I mean, those words, they were acidic. There seemed to be condemnation, and there was condemnation of the sexual perversions and of the economic injustices that were found among the people of God. What was happening was the morality of the Israelites was not much different than the immoralities of the Canaanites. And that rightfully upset God, and so God would have His prophets speak out. And they didn't mildly suggest to the Israelites that they were sinning. The prophets, go back and read them, men, they just outright blasted the Israelites for their sexual perversions and their economic injustices. But let's take it a step farther. Let's come back this way a little bit, because Jesus' own words to the Pharisees were lethal, right? I mean, He said, you bunch of hypocrites, you snakes. And He didn't do that just once. He did it several times. He said, you hypocrites, you phonies. In other words, Jesus' tongue was a little salty sometimes. It was sharp, it was biting when it was needed. Let me go back to Martin Luther for just a minute, because in this sermon that he wrote in 1532, he said this: salt is to bring seasoning to life. And I know that salt really adds flavor to life. One of our roles, I think, as being the salt of the earth, is to bring flavor to life. If you're a person who loves God, who walks with Jesus, who follows Jesus, if you're a person of forgiveness and kindness, if you're a person who brings generosity to those who are hurting, if you're that kind of person, there's a flavor that you bring to your workplace or your school or your community. Jesus said, you are the salt of the earth. You are the light of the world. And it wasn't just talking about salt and light, basically, and the main factor, as I said earlier, was He saying, you are the salt of the earth. But then He goes immediately to these words: if salt has lost its flavor, what use is it to anyone? He says you might as well just throw it away. So here's the thing. We don't decide if we are the salt of the earth, if we're going to be the salt or the light. We don't make those decisions. Jesus already proclaimed, you are the salt of the earth. What we decide on a daily basis is this: are we going to speak up? Have we lost our saltiness? Do we really still have value in our world? You're the light of the world. Is our light shining so others can see? Have we found some kind of a basket to cover it with? It's not whether we're the salt and the light, because Jesus claims we are. It's what are we doing being the salt and the light? What are we doing with that? Would you pray with me?